All right, welcome everyone to week 12, when we're looking at the criminally insane and the way crime and punishment kind of interacts with folks who've got severe, severe mental health problems. Like we'll talk about that in a second and kind of what the premise for the lecture is. But today I want to start by offering the icebreaker. Here it is. Um, and which hero or villain origin story is your favorite? I'm gonna go ahead and answer mine here, but I want you to go over to the discussion board and go ahead and make your answer. Um, I think my favorite hero origin story is my favorite villain origin story is Magneto. I'm just really, I think he's the best villain ever created. And being a Holocaust survivor is a big deal and kind of informs, especially through the 60s, 70s, and 80s with the X-Men comics, all of his severe reactions to anybody who has kind of a racist approach to um, uh, any kind of lawmaking. And then, of course, he's very worried about a second mutant holocaust happening, which, if you've read Days of Future Past, at least in one alternate future, absolutely comes to pass. I think for a modern day, we're getting farther and farther away from the Holocaust as a historical event, and so it gets harder and harder to place Magneto in the context of that story. And so I think um, for the modern day, a um, better context for that would be like the Rwandan genocide. So I hope that the Marvel universe, when they incorporate the X-Men, are able to kind of update his story. Otherwise, you got to get into time travel and bringing someone forward, or an alternate world where the Holocaust happened later, like maybe it was an event that happened in the 80s instead of happening in the 40s, which would be really weird, but doable, I suppose. But yeah, what I'm, yeah, yeah. And I would like Lakeith Stanfield if we did a Black Magneto, because there's nothing inherently white about Magneto. His Jewishness is a big deal because of his Holocaust backstory, but you could still get all of the same storytelling beats by moving Magneto to a modern day conflict and having, a person of African descent play him. And I think Lakeith Stanfield would just be an absolutely menacing Magneto. And I think he would do a stellar job. If you've never seen Harder They Fall on Netflix. It's a fictional story, but it features several historically real people. So it's historical fiction. It's a black cowboy movie. If you like westerns, it's pretty amazing. Um, but yeah, he plays a bad guy in that, and watching him be that character was pretty frightening. So I think he could do a really good job as Magneto. So today we want to talk about crime and punishment, and in particular, we want to talk about how laws interact with people um, who aren't maybe responsible for their actions. Now, not every state allows an insanity plea when they're talking about. Sorry, I'm looking it up. Um, okay, sorry, I'm back. I have my facts straight now. Most states do allow an insanity plea for any kind of capital crime. Some states don't. States that do not are Idaho, Kansas, Montana, and Utah. And they don't allow um, an insanity defense, but instead allow a guilty by insane verdict, which means the defendant is sent to a mental institution instead of a prison. Um, and then some states, most notably New York, don't allow a defense by insanity at all. Um, so yeah, interesting. So last week we kind of touched on some of the issues with modern policing, and you watched a video from Harvard that um, talked about the history of city police. And so on the flip side of that, I mean that's kind of the idea about how what I wanted you to take away from that is kind of how police interact with everyday people, right? Folks who have all their mental faculties, folks who are speeding or any number of minor crimes that lead to an unnecessary escalation. What we're going to talk about this week are crimes that fascinate. And of course, everybody knows that there's a huge true crime fascination in this country, and especially recently. Um, there are plenty of jokes about white women and their true crime podcasts. But what we want to talk about today are things that would make those podcasts, right? These big sensational crimes, which in do happen in the real world, but are far more rare than your average speeder or jaywalker or even tax evader, to a degree. Uh, but we want to talk about things that are like serial killers and spree killers and um, those kind of crimes. So um, active at any given time in the United States, and this is a huge decline since the advent of both mental health treatment and also modern crime fighting techniques like DNA analysis and those kind of things, and obviously the pretty significant increase in cameras and home alarm systems and all those things. But in the 1970s, there was an estimated 300 active serial killers at any given time, and that number has fallen dramatically to about 50. But at any given time in the United States since about the year 2000, there's an estimation that there are about 50 active serial killers. And those are folks that follow the serial killer or that fall under the serial killer pathology and those kind of things, but um, don't necessarily include things like mass shootings, which would be another form of sensational crime, right? So um, what we're going to do for context and to kind of get back into the content of the course a little bit and talk about them in the context of graphic novels as opposed to bringing up a bunch of real true crime cases, which you can find on your own. There's plenty of great true crime podcasts out there. And every famous serial killer has at least one documentary and probably also a movie about them. But you can find multiple documentaries if you're really interested in digging into like real world serial killers. But what I want to do is take a single hero's rogues gallery. That's the term that comics use for a group of villains that fight a single hero or are associated with a single hero. And we're going to use the most famous one. In comics, we're going to talk about Batman's rogues gallery. And what we're going to do is talk about uh, these villains in a sliding scale of insanity, from the most crazy to the least crazy, and kind of talk about how the law might approach them. And then you can draw all sorts of your own conclusions and comparisons to folks active in the real world. So, of course, if we're going to start with the craziest person in Batman's rogues gallery, most of you have probably already guessed, but we are going to start with the Joker. Now, the Joker is almost as old as Batman himself. He was created in the 40s, and I think he's created the same year as Robin, so he's one of Batman's oldest villains, and he's widely regarded, though I disagree, as the best comic villain of all time. And what I don't like about Joker compared to someone like Magneto was I think villains are interesting when they have a point. I think villains are interesting when they have a cause or a grievance. And Joker doesn't seem to have any of those things. And in fact, Heath Ledger's Joker from Dark Knight uh, explicitly says, like, I'm just a dog chasing cars. I'm an agent of chaos. Like, I don't have a point. And, Joker's been compared to a lot of other people who are just, legitimately crazy for crazy's sake. And while I think that has some storytelling value, I don't think it has all the storytelling value. And so I think that there are a limited number of stories you can tell and tell well with the point of the character being just insanity. And so while there are a large number of great Joker stories out there, Killing Joke, again, widely considered to be the best Joker story ever told, uh, Death of the Family and A Death in the Family are both excellent Joker stories. Those stories are few and far between. If I were to name the best Batman stories, most of them probably wouldn't include Joker at all. And what I think is the best Batman story ever told, which is The Court of Owls, barely touches on him. He's also a pretty minor figure in The Long Halloween, which I think is probably the best Batman series ever done. Um, and he's, you know, almost nowhere to be found in some of the other major. I mean, he's a major player in Dark Knight Returns, Frank Miller's kind of Batman Renaissance, but the best episodes of uh so the best comics I think feature Batman's other villains. Now, the best episodes of Batman the Animated Series outside of a one really, 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 really good Riddler episode are all Joker centric. And the ones that are super famous, like Mad Love, which we'll talk about when we get to Harley, um, even got novel adaptations. But that is largely due to the chemistry of the voice actors. Mark Hamill, yes, Luke Skywalker, voiced Joker in Batman the Animated Series, if you didn't know. And then, of course, the late, great Kevin Conroy, who's kind of the most iconic Batman voice actor ever. Bruce Greenwood, who's doing all the modern Batmans, is pretty good, but he's no Kevin Conroy. Um, their chemistry and the way those stories are written were really good. And so I think Joker gets an artificial boost in popularity from Batman the Animated Series with Mark Hamill, Heath Ledger's Joker, and there's even more mystique around that role because that role, ultimately led to Heath Ledger's death. And then the Todd Phillips Joker movie. I don't know if any of you have seen Boyle Ado, the um, new Joker movie, but I have not heard good things. I will see it um, uh, before your papers are due, your extra credit opportunity on it are due, but it's not. Yeah, I've heard just awful things about the movie. And I had said beforehand that I didn't think it was a movie that needed a sequel, and that I thought that it would actually harm Todd Phillips's first take out of the Joker movie. And I often made the joke that he's like, I don't want to do a sequel, like let it stand alone. And the studios are like, but here's all this money. And he's like, no, I don't want to do it. And they're like, here's even more money. And he said, fine, but I'm going to make it a musical. And they were like, deal. And then he was stuck making it. And I haven't heard anyone talk like say good things about the new Joker movie. So that's pretty rare. Usually even bad comic book movies have some defenders. So, um, but yeah. Joker's an interesting case because some clinical psychologists think that the way he manifests his symptoms make it so that he can't be a real character. I had heard from some folks say that the different types of psychoses that Joker displays would indicate competing malformations in his brain and just simply aren't possible. So I asked a colleague of mine, Dr. Ben Jepson. Here is his. This is an email response. You can pause it here. I know that I appear in like a window, and I might be top right, but you can pause this and kind of read around it. And I'm just going to highlight some things. So go ahead and pause and read through this now, and then when you come back, we'll talk about some things that are standouts from here. So three, two, one, pause. Okay, assuming you've paused and read through this and came back, what I really want to point you to is that Dr. Jepson here is really talking about so first of all, he's a clinical psychologist from I think Nebraska, the University of Nebraska. He and I know each other from the con circuit. We've done several panels together, talking about Batman and his psychology and kind of the philosophy behind it. So Dr. Jepson is great. Um, but what I want to point your attention to is that even this clinical psychologist who specializes, he's even written a book about Batman, who specializes in this, can't come to a distinct diagnosis. And of course, mental health and disorders like aren't perfect, right? They're usually a slew of symptoms that make up a diagnosis, and you people don't always fit in neat little boxes. And in fact, they rarely fit in neat little boxes. But here we even say in the underneath his list of 7 things in that thing, he said, if I were a clinician, I would overlook this requirement and give him the ASPD diagnosis. And so Joker's presentation as a character is so all over the map that even clinical psychologists can't agree on what he may or may not have. So from a mental health standpoint, who knows? Joker, who knows? From a legal standpoint, Joker would be most likely classified as a spree killer. What separates serial killers from spree killers is methodology and pathology. When we talk about methodology, spree killers will typically reach for whatever causes the biggest amount of damage over the shortest amount of time. And what that is irrelevant. It doesn't have a story, it doesn't hold a significance. You go on a killing spree and you kill as many people as possible, and really the how doesn't matter. For serial killers, the how very much matters and becomes part of a ritual almost. And I say ritual, I don't necessarily mean like a magic one, although plenty of serial killers have relied on occult behavior and occult approaches to their pathology, but it's not required. And so what you're looking at here is actually a character that doesn't necessarily care about the how. And sure, he's got some gimmicks, and you could argue that he's got a ritual, but it doesn't matter if he's poisoning Gotham's water, which is one of his earliest appearances, one of his earliest schemes, or if he's getting people with his spray flower that's acid, or if he's beating them to death with a crowbar. Joker cares about body count. And yeah, he's got gimmicks, and yeah, that follows a thing, but he's missing some pieces to call him a serial killer. The kill itself isn't serialized. It isn't fetishized. It's his shtick getting there, and so we wouldn't call Joker a serial killer. In fact, there are relatively few traditional serial killers in Gotham. And when I say relatively few, it's kind of a surprise. As much emphasis as DC Comics puts on Batman's detective ability and those kind of things, it's a surprise. So, moving on from Joker, we come to his protege and sometime girlfriend, Harley Quinn. Now, Harley, the other thing you're going to find about as we go through Gotham's Rogues Gallery is there's a surprising number of folks with degrees. Uh, not just college degrees, but we're talking PhDs or medical degrees. And the shock here, or even JDs, in order to practice law, you have to have what's called a Juris Doctorate. So all lawyers are also doctors because they have a doctorate. But a shocking number of the Rogues Gallery has these high level IQ or this high level education. Joker doesn't. The commonly accepted origin for Joker is that he's kind of a middling nobody until his accident. Harley is a documented PhD in psychology, and she becomes obsessed with Joker while working in Arkham Asylum. And then Joker manipulates her into getting him free, and then she puts him through the same kind of physical explosion that he went through in the chemicals at Ace Chemical to make her Harlequin. Um, for for all of the weirdness around the Jared Leto, Margot Robbie iterations of these characters, Margot Robbie does a great job with Harley, and that scene where in Suicide Squad where Harley gets dropped into the chemicals is actually pretty accurate to the comics. Harley, of course, was created for Batman the Animated Series. Her voice actress passed away a couple of years ago. Her main voice actress, Tara Strong, has taken over that role in most of the animated media. There have been a couple other people who've taken a crack at the role, but Arlene Sorkin, who was the original voice actress, is also gone now. Um, so a lot of folks that worked on that original that 1990 series have passed. Harley would also technically be called a spree killer, although for her, it's not about the murder and the mayhem. It's really about pleasing. It's really about focusing on and pleasing Joker, which gives her a really kind of sick and twisted relationship with Joker. She's a much healthier character after she leaves Joker and enters a relationship with Poison Ivy, although it's really hard to say that relationship is healthy either. Um, Harley has a form of Stockholm syndrome in addition to all the other mental health things that she's got. She also often hallucinates, talks to herself, and hears voices. She sees or manifests her previous self her more formal psychology self often, and that's actually portrayed really, really well in the Harley Quinn TV series that's on HBO Max, where Kelly Cuoco voices Harley, and Lake Bell voices Poison Ivy, Alan Tujic's in that. It's just a really, really, really well done series, um, and shows Harley's kind of psychosis. But Harley's got again disorder stacked on disorder, stacked on disorder, stacked on disorder that kind of makes it hard to believe she's real or even possible. Um, moving on, uh, this is Victor Zsasz, and Victor Zsasz is a tried and true serial killer. So with Joker and with Harley, and actually with most of these villains, they don't spend time in Blackgate, which is the Gotham area state prison that you would think of like Rikers, um, or San Quentin, I think in California is the big one. I could be wrong. But these are you don't find these people don't go there. They do what's happened like the guilty by insanity, and they end up incarcerated in a mental institution where most of them are beyond rehabilitation. I asked Dr. Jepson how many of Batman's villains he thought was actually rehabilitatable through therapy, and he kind of laughed at me, and didn't really give me a strong answer. I think the kind of pull for his profession is that no one's beyond help, but these characters are so portrayed as literally beyond help that there's not much we can do for them. For Zaz, he actually was a businessman. I don't know if he's got a doctorate or not, but he ran a business and he was wealthy. And one night he loses all of his money gambling and is destitute and is depressed, and he's um, on his way out, and I think he might be inebriated, and he encounters a homeless person whom he kills, and he has a psychotic break, and then kind of starts to view killing people as releasing them from a flesh prison. In fact, he refers to especially the women he kills as angels that are trapped on Earth, and he's releasing them. Um, and while we're in our human bodies, he calls us pigs. And so for Zaz, it is a compulsion, and it's also kind of a thing where he thinks he's doing the right thing. Now, you'll notice there's a bunch of tally marks all over his body. This is a picture of Zaz from Injustice, but this is how he looks. It's just the most clear version of him. Zaz is someone who, after he kills someone, he goes through scarification as his trophy. Serial killers will often take something from their victims, whether that's a tooth or a piece of skin or whatever, depending on how they're depicted. Jewelry often, hair is common. Zaz instead takes a reminder and puts it on his own flesh. So every hash mark is someone he's killed. So you can see he's got quite the body count in uh, the DC universe, and most, if not all of those people are killed in Gotham. So we get to Clayface. Clayface in the original Clayface, there have been a few of them, but the original Clayface is a actor named Basil Karlo. He's named after Basil Boris Karloff as kind of an homage to one of the original uh, um, Universal monster movie actors. He's very famous for being able to kind of change his face. And in the comics and in the series, Clayface is getting older. He's not getting as many leading man roles as he used to. He's starting to show his age. He can't quite do the acting job the way that he used to. And so he is tempted by Roland Daggett, who Daggett Industries in Gotham is like the evil Wayne Industries or Wayne Enterprises. And Daggett is creating this new cosmetic cream that's supposed to make your skin really elastic and make you look a lot younger. And Boris or Basil tries it and it works. But the side effects are if he's not constantly applying it, his skin gets droopy and saggy. He goes to Daggett, demands more of it. Daggett's like, we can't give you this. It's dangerous. Like it's not tested. You weren't supposed to use it in the first place. And there's a scuffle ensues, and Clayface ends up in an again a chemical explosion that turns him into this. Now, for the most part, this is what Clayface looks like. He can exert quite a bit of control over his body and take really any form he wants to, but he can't hold it very long. This leads to kind of like an abandonment of his original identity. The uh, Basil Carlo identity, and he kind of loses who he was. This is kind of similar in the real world to when Christopher, or not Christopher, goodness, Gary Oldman actually forgot how he originally sounded. He lost his own accent because he would do too many accents and had to go through work with a vocal coach to get his original British accent back. Super fascinating that those kind of things can happen when you inhabit so many other identities, even for your job or for work, and you're not trying to become them. You can really lose a sense of self. And so Clayface has a subsumed identity. I don't know that there's any kind of actual diagnosis for this happening. I've never heard of like a subsumed identity disorder, but he's replaced the old identity with the new one. And it's not dissociative identity disorder. It's not like he said, hey, there's two of me here. We're going to get to some characters who have rather poor depictions of did. Um, but he's saying I'm not that old thing anymore. I'm this new monstrous thing, and I don't know that there's a diagnosis for that. Uh, Jervis Tetch is the Mad Hatter, and like Carlo, Tetch's mental illness, and actually like Joker and Harley. Well, Joker's for sure. Harley had a touch of her mental illness showing before her injury. It just brought it forward. Harley had a very traumatic childhood. Her dad was possibly abusive. Um, Zaz has a psychotic break, doesn't seem to have any kind of injury. It's circumstances that leads him to his thing. But Joker, Tetch, and Carlo all have accidents, or injuries or poisonings that change their brain. There's two ways a violent criminal, sorry, there's two ways that someone who is violently criminally insane are made. In one way, they're born that way. Um, Dr. James Fallon, not to be confused with Jimmy Fallon from The Tonight Show, but Dr. James Fallon uh, is a famous neuroscientist. He works at UC Irvine. You can Google his TED Talks, and I might go ahead and add his TED Talk on the psychopath inside to this week to watch. Actually, I'm going to do that. He talks about getting access to brain scans from serial killers and being able to identify a specific malformation of the brain that causes them to go in, like they might be causing it. And then he scans himself and realizes he has the exact same malformation, and so he's one bad term paper away from being his own version of a psychopath. It's fascinating. So I'll include that. I'll find it and I'll include it in the watch. Um, so sometimes they're born that way, and the other way they get there is being injured. Um, that's the other way you can have kind of that to the brain. And for Jervis Tetch, he was an actual hat maker. And you may or may not know the term mad as a hatter or mad hatter comes from old hat making techniques where they would make hats using mercury, and the mercury would seep into your skin, and then it would poison your brain, and then you would go nuts. And that is what happened to Jervis. Also, his name was Jervis. So, he wasn't starting from a great place. And Tetch was married to a woman named Alice. And as a result, they kind of had a cutesy Alice in Wonderland thing going. As he gets crazier, Alice leaves him, touches, doesn't stop doing his hat making. He gets worse and worse and worse. Then he becomes a violent man and replaces his kind of like becomes the Mad Hatter in a way. And that's his nom de guerre here. He's the Mad Hatter. And he has an obsession with Alice in Wonderland. And his big crime is serial kidnapping. So, in the same way that a serial killer has a type and a methodology and all of that matters, Tetch's methodology matters to him too. He kidnaps young blonde women that look like Alice from Alice in Wonderland. And he's really just trying to get his ex back. Super toxic, but does have a really neat kind of real world cause. Now, everyone we've talked about so far, if they were brought up on charges, would likely have their lawyer argue, hey, they're not really in possession of their full faculties. They're not really someone who can stand trial. They don't even necessarily know what they did was wrong. Now, Harley clearly has a sense of right and wrong, knows what's right and wrong, doesn't care. Carlo seems to have lost his sense of right and wrong in his accident. Joker seems to not think there is such a thing as right and wrong. And Tetch also doesn't think what he's doing is wrong. He thinks what he's doing is actually right and romantic, which is maybe even a little scarier. But when we get into Scarecrow, there we've got someone who has a clear. Uh, so when Harley doesn't know right from wrong, the argument is still that she's an obsessive compulsive or she's an obsessive. She's wrapped around Joker's finger. Maybe she's not in full, full possession of her faculties, doesn't really know what's going on, and is under the control of a madman. When we get to Scarecrow, here's someone who very clearly knows right from wrong, very clearly has a sense of good and evil, and chooses the bad. And so Scarecrow is the first of our people where you could make an argument and say like, okay, he might be able to stand trial for himself. Um, Although Scarecrow also is a result of a poisoning, it's kind of a different setup from what happened to the rest of them. So Scarecrow's real name is Jonathan Crane. Yes, that's an Ichabod Crane reference from Sleepy Hollow. Crane is also a PhD, also a psychologist. So far we've got two PhDs, a famous actor, and then just like a regular hat maker and a Joe Schmo. They're gonna get more PhD DE from here. But Scarecrow's a psychology PhD, and he's actually researching fear, and he's trying to figure out what causes fear. Da, 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 da. And so he creates the fear gas, which if you've seen any Scarecrow media, you know is like his thing. Well, it's revealed that he's experimenting on students without their knowledge, and his argument was like, well, if they know, then the 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 research isn't good. And so Gotham University kicks him out. They take away his tenure. They, call him a criminal and how like unethical it is. And so to continue his experiments, he uses the fear gas on himself, but he accidentally ODs and destroys his fear center. So now Scarecrow cannot feel fear. That's kind of his thing. There's always a big climactic cinematic, oh no, where Batman makes him feel some fear, and that's kind of the shtick. But like for the most part, Scarecrow doesn't feel fear. He doesn't recognize it. It doesn't motivate him. His brain doesn't react to it because his fear center in his brain is damaged from a drug overdose. But he's still obsessed with observing it and studying it, and so he still uses that fear toxin on other people and tries to create the nightmariest nightmares possible. So this is where you might go, well, okay, his brain isn't super functional. He might have a moral center or at least the ability to recognize right and wrong. But for him, because he doesn't fear consequences, there's a piece of that that's missing. And so maybe he's not fully responsible for his own actions. Uh, Two-Face, uh, also Harvey Dent. Harvey is Gotham's district attorney, so he's got that JD. He's a lawyer doctor. And Two-Face generously could be considered to have dissociative identity disorder. Now, there's there's a lot we don't know about did, and there's a lot where experts will even fight each other. For the most part, the research suggests that the types of conversations with alternate personalities, or alters for short, that Two-Face has in the comics aren't real. Now, it is kind of suggested that alters can talk to each other and are aware of each other, but they talk to each other through either a dream space, which if you've ever seen Doom Patrol, Crazy Jane has a dream space where her alters can speak to each other. So when they're asleep, or through like notes. So like one alter can write the other alter a note and if they're aware of each other. But often someone's not even aware they have alters all the time. And so this kind of idea where two distinct personalities are simultaneously in control of a body and are able to have out loud verbal conversations with each other, switching back and forth on the fly, isn't accurate. There's been some, there's been a pretty severe rise in the social media spaces about uh, with people faking dissociative identity disorder, um, even to the point where someone who, by the way, is a trained voice actor, and I can't remember the name of this account, they've been discredited since, but would go back and forth having conversations on TikTok for views. And while I do think that to some degree, using social media to destigmatize mental health problems is probably a good thing, and letting people know they need to get help. Most of the people who claim they have did on TikTok don't, and it's pretty offensive that they're faking disorders to try to get clout. It's pretty gross. So this is a bad representation of dissociative identity disorder. It would be possible for Harvey to have two personalities and for those personalities to even interact, like I've said, through notes or whatever. But this kind of discussion back and forth between the identities isn't really accurate. And also, add to that Two-Face's dissociative identity, he's also got an obsession with pairs or twos or heads or tails, a pretty strong compulsion, to the point where oftentimes you can see here in this image that he's freaking out because no one told him how the coin flip came up. That's a common way Batman beats him, to either take away the coin. For those that don't know, Harvey normally has this really old coin that's a double-headed coin, and one side's either burned or scarred or cut up or whatever. And Batman will either mix a bunch of that same coin in or take the coin or whatever. And it is an object that Two-Face is entirely attached to. And so just removing the one object usually removes the danger or causes him to go into a meltdown like this. Obviously, much more dangerous if you have a gun or if he's got a gun. But there's still a legal argument to be made that Harvey isn't in full control of himself, and so standing trial may not be possible. We're getting close to the transition between able to stand trial versus not. And so this is Garfield Lynns, aka Firefly. Uh, Firefly is a serial arsonist. Two-Face would be hard. So going back, Jonathan Crane and Two-Face would be hard to qualify what they really are. Um, I mean, they are spree killers, but for the most part, they're really like organized crime bosses who kind of just have a laundry list of crimes under their belt. It's much easier to deal with Firefly. Firefly's a serial arsonist. And when I say serial, I mean it. There's a fetish that goes into this. There's ritual. The types of places he burns all matter. Usually they're fire stations. Lynns was a firefighter, and he gets caught in a fire, and it burns most of his body, and so that's why he's in the suit. And he becomes a pyrophiliac, and I said that on purpose, because the fire also gives him sexual gratification. So yeah, not a pyromaniac, a pyrophiliac. That is what he be doing. But Garfield, while he is compulsed to make fires, I think it would his lawyers would have a really hard time uh convincing a jury that he doesn't necessarily know what he's doing because of the sexual component. But we're still in a place where it's possible to mount a not guilty by insanity or guilty by insanity defense around what he's doing. This is Dr. Kirk Langstrom, aka Man-Bat. This is my sister's favorite villain in any media ever. She loves Man-Bat. Dr. Langstrom, Man-Bat is like the Lizard from Marvel. So if you're more familiar with the Marvel movies, the Spider-Man movies, Dr. Kurt Connors and Dr. Kirk Langstrom are very similar to each other. Connors is the Lizard from Marvel. Langstrom is our Bat. Langstrom is doing similar research, trying to combine human and animal DNA, uh, where the Lizard is trying to bring his arm back, Connors is trying to, I don't know, I think cure cancer maybe, and he's convinced that like bat DNA is the key to like overcoming some kind of cancer. And so, like Scarecrow, the university figures out that Connors is doing weird experiments and takes away his funding and shuts him down. And Connors like last hope. Oh, I remember. Nope. Nope, never mind. I don't remember what's going on here. Anyway, he's doing a weird experiment, and he turns into this monster when he does it on himself. And they kind of gloss over it in the Batman the Animated Series episode, but in all the other media, Langstrom turns into this monster and then kills his wife. And when he comes back, he can't face what he did. And so he's actually out to permanently make this transition into the mindless monster so that he no longer has to deal with his guilt. Um, yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, he's a thief for sure. Obviously a violent criminal when he's in the Man-Bat form. He's murdered, but I don't know that you've got a pathology to put around that other than he's trying to escape grief through batification. This is Killer Croc. Now this is a really weird version of Killer Croc. You'll notice if you look up at his eyes, he's got like almost spider eyes going on. But I love this image mostly because of the bite out of the person at the bottom of it. And then Batwoman in the bottom right hand corner, like, I'm gonna hit him with a batarang after Talia has just like filled him full of arrows, like it's gonna help. Uh, but uh, Croc is originally Waylon Jones, and he's born with a physical deformity that makes his skin scaly like a reptile. And then he grows up a circus attraction, and then um, different, more modern versions of him have him going out of his way to talk to people like Langstrom or Ra's al Ghul or anyone else who might have the ability to make him more crocodilian. And so this is kind of a more modern version. The eyes are a little creepy. He doesn't always have those, but now he's much bigger. He has a tail. He doesn't have a problem eating human beings. Um, and he does, for the most part, have a solid sense of right and wrong. Sometimes the animal nature, as he gets more and more animalistic, takes over, and yeah, he loses that ability, like Langstrom, to tell the difference between right and wrong. But we're pretty much at the threshold now where the reason that Killer Croc doesn't go to Blackgate versus Arkham is because Blackgate doesn't have the facility to hold a giant alligator. Arkham doesn't always either. Sometimes Croc is just thrown in the sewer and forgotten about, and occasionally thrown aside of beef. If you've never played any of the Arkham games, the Batman video games, and you are a video game person, I highly recommend them. Especially Arkham Asylum has a really, really intense um, Killer Croc sequence, and it's really good. So now we're to where someone would absolutely be able to stand trial if we knew who they were. This is Hush, aka Tommy Elliott. Tommy Elliott is Bruce Wayne's best friend from elementary school. The Elliots and the Cobblepots and the Waynes, we'll talk about the Cobblepots here in a minute. But the Elliots, the Cobblepots, and the Waynes are all um, old Gotham money. They're all founding families. And so, of course, the rich Elliots and the rich Waynes know each other, and the boys are friends. Uh, Thomas Wayne is who Tommy Elliott is named after. That's how close they are. And Thomas Wayne, if you're familiar with the Batman backstory at all, is a doctor. Sometimes he's a neurosurgeon, sometimes he's a heart surgeon, but he's always a doctor. And the Elliots die in a car crash, and well, they're in a car crash, and then they later die on one of them dies on Thomas Wayne's table, and so Tommy Elliott gets it in his head that Thomas Wayne didn't save his family on purpose, and so he vows to kill Thomas and Martha. Well, then Thomas and Martha are then shortly thereafter gunned down by someone in Crime Alley, and so Tommy uh, decides that he's going to punish Bruce instead. And so Tommy, the reason Hush's bandages are all done that way is because Tommy also goes to medical school and becomes a brilliant doctor and a plastic surgeon. And then he slowly murders people and takes parts of their faces to make his face look like Bruce's face so that he can become Bruce Wayne and discredit Bruce and take his identity. So he's a really extreme identity thief. For his base diagnosis. Also a murderer, right? Also obsessive compulsive. But I think you'd absolutely be able to put Tommy on trial, not necessarily as a madman, but as someone who's just really focused on taking out a single person for revenge because it's got a clear motive. This is Poison Ivy. This is her Arkham Asylum outfit, and I chose this outfit not because it's ooh sexy lady in green, although it is. I chose this image because I like the version of Pamela where she is more plant than human. There are certainly other depictions of her where she is just a normal lady who happened to have a chemical accident. So always Pamela Isley is a PhD botanist. She's always a plant doctor. Um, In some versions, a fellow doctor, usually Jason Woodrue, uh, experiments on himself and becomes the Floronic Man, which is basically an ent. He becomes a tree man, and then he goes further and experiments on Pamela. He does some kind of a thing to turn Pamela also into a plant person because he's in love with her. Pamela always rejects Jason. Jason isn't anywhere near as important to the Batman narrative as Pamela is. And then Pamela, usually now, and especially more modern depictions, has the green skin as opposed to just a green outfit. And she's gone further into what DC calls the green. The green is the biosphere that wraps around the earth and all living things, but especially all growing things, make it up. If you've ever heard of Swamp Thing, he is the living embodiment of the green and he's its defender. Pamela also can tap into the green, which gives her the control over the plants. So, in her more human depictions, yeah, she can mix and mess with plant pheromones and poisons and those kind of things. In her more uh, um, modern, I guess, kind of more advanced. You notice here she looks like she's controlling the vines with her mind. That is something she's got more access to, kind of like mid 2000s and forward. And certainly the Arkham games portray her that way, that she can actually interact with the plants and feel what they feel and control them. So this is the depiction of her I like the best. Pamela is the first person on our list who could be classified as a terrorist. And in fact, most accurately, they would call Pamela an eco-terrorist because she does a lot of property damage and a lot, I mean, obviously a lot of murder, but she specifically disrupts and destroys new construction, any pollutants, folks who are seeking to harm the natural world. Pamela takes them out. This is Victor Fries. Victor is also a doctor, and see, I told you we were going to get a lot more PhD. He is a cryologist. He works on cryogenic freezing. He's a also, I think he might be a hematologist. Anyway, he's a doctor. He is while he is a he's researcher. He's doing medical research, and his wife Nora Fries. Um, their last name is Fries. They don't have anything to do with cold until after this accident. But Nora comes down with a rare blood condition. Victor's trying to cure her. Then there is a uh, lack of funding, and they try to unplug Nora from her cryogenic freezing, which would kill her. And so Freeze, in that accident, steps up and kills another doctor, trying to fight for his wife. And then there's an accident where Freeze is exposed. Victor is exposed to the cryogenic freezing, and it turns him into this. So Victor kind of always has to be in a cold suit or in a really cold environment. And his wife is still frozen, and he's still trying to cure her. So Victor has a super pure motivation. He is obviously a murderer and a thief, but it's all for this kind of specific reason. And if someone would just fund the research on Nora, he'd stop doing those things. And in fact, there have been multiple times in the comics where Batman has just given Victor money to stop, and it's worked. Mr. Freeze, by the way, my favorite Batman villain. I think being willing to go to the ends for your partner is a pretty great motivation. And Victor has a clear sense of right and wrong, and so does this man, Edward Nigma. Now, Freeze, Ivy, everybody up to this point has some kind of injury or brain malfunction or compulsion that points them towards, hey, maybe I'm a little, ooh, maybe I've got something going on. By the time we get to Riddler, well, really Mr. Freeze and Riddler, um, the idea that they're mentally ill to the point where they would be allowed to submit an insanity plea is kind of gone. Everybody has a clear sense of right and wrong. Everybody knows what they're doing. Everyone has different motivations. Riddler's motivation, at least in everything but the Batman, which I wasn't in love with Paul Dano's weird incel Riddler. It really felt more jokery than Riddler-y to me. And I still hope that if Ben Affleck does come back at Batman at some point, like they've been talking about, that we get a Neil Patrick Harris Riddler. I think that would be the best casting of all time. But Edward Nigma or Edward Nashton, depending on which version, he's just incredibly smart and underappreciated. And he is really like his ideas are stolen by people that are further up him on the corporate ladder. And he's really just an abused worker who finally decides that he's not going to take it anymore and he's going to show everyone that he's smarter than them. And then he does that in the Gothamiest way by adopting a mask and a suit and putting Batman through these really god awful challenges that oftentimes end up where other people lose their lives. Now, Riddler in particular is one of only like a few people that have ever been able to figure out who Batman is. And then Batman convinces him to not tell anyone because the secret would no longer have power if he gave it to anyone else. And if he told other people who he was, it wouldn't matter how he found out. They would now know, and that knowledge would be less valuable. And so Riddler's like, "Yeah, you're right. This is my secret now, and I know." Mwahaha. It's kind of an interesting way to play on Riddler's psychoses. So I put Ra's al Ghul here. There's a real chance that Ra's al Ghul doesn't belong this high up on the list. In fact, he'd be way further down. But the question you have to ask yourself, and the question that every fan has to kind of deal with, and different iterations have played on the idea that maybe he's not serious when he says he's been alive since the Crusades. But we do know that the Lazarus pits are a fact, especially any version of the story where Jason Todd's still alive. That's how they bring him back. Um, and so you kind of got to come to grips with the fact that, yeah, Ra's al Ghul's probably like 900 years old or 800 years old, and he really does want to topple societies. He's got an okay motivation, right? Society's corrupt, gotta sack Rome or whatever. But um, being alive that long would do something to the psyche. And then we know that Lazarus Pits, when you come back, you don't always come back with 100% of your faculties. And so they've been slowly driving Ra's crazy. Um, but for the most part, he's under complete control, understands right and wrong, just disagrees with what that is, and figures since he's long lived, he has a different view of morality than a normal person would, and he knows better than they do. And now we're with Raish, with Riddler, Raish, and then kind of finalizing with Bane. We're moving away from people who have injuries or severe compulsions and into people who have a traumatic background that's just changed their way of thinking. Bane is maybe I've mentioned this before when we talked about people of color, but he's born on Santa. Yes, we did. I gave his backstory. He's born on Santa Prisca. He's Latino. He's from a place where he was raised in prison because his father was a criminal. Kills his first man very young. He's in an environment much like being a child soldier in Africa, where his brain is under constant adrenaline floods, which is not good and absolutely stunts your brain and changes the way you develop as a person. And then on top of that, Bane has a pretty severe drug addiction. But I don't think anyone would let those things, I don't think a jury would be sympathetic to those things with the crimes that Bane has committed. This is Dr. Hugo Strange. We're kind of now past the traumatic backstory and now into just this guy's kind of a douche and is just a criminal without needing some kind of criminal insanity. And so we're now definitely in a place where people would stand trial. Hugo Strange is a psychologist. He's just obsessed with Batman's psychology and wants to bring him down. The best use of him ever in any media is in the Dark Knight, or sorry, Arkham Knight. Nope. One more time, Arkham City game. Best use of him as a villain, where he really acts through the Tiger security force that kind of helps him take down criminals. Um, Much better. This is Floyd Lawton, aka Deadshot. He's a professional assassin. He views killing as his job, and while that certainly makes people go like, "Oh, maybe he's got some mental health diagnoses," eh, he doesn't seem to. He doesn't have regret when he kills, and maybe that's an indication that he's maybe a sociopath, but he also seems to very much care for his family. One of the reasons he does this job is to take care of his daughter. And so that kind of moves us away from the idea that he's a sociopath because he does seem to feel and process real emotion. This is just how he interacts with the world. And so I think that a jury would not find, yeah, would find the idea that he isn't like a tried and true sociopath to be less convincing for like a mental health defense. This is Oswald Cobblepot, aka the Penguin, and I said I would mention him we talk about the Cobblepots. Gotham has like 14 or 15 founding families. The Elliots, the Waynes, and the Cobblepots are three of them. The Cobblepots are old money, but they lose their fortune. And then they have Oswald, who is a somewhat deformed child. Sometimes in the comics, Oswald's hands are fused, so they look penguiny. They did that for Batman Returns. Most of the time, he just is short and fat and has like a beaky nose. But Penguin isn't insane. Like from everywhere from like Riddler forward, we're not dealing with people that are insane, either little I or capital I. Penguin instead has had a really traumatic childhood, a big inferiority complex that kind of led him to latching on to the bird motif, and then he becomes an arms dealer and a the guy who can get anything and an organized crime boss. I'm really excited to see. I have not yet finished the series that's out on HBO Max, but the Batman with Pattinson gave us a really interesting Colin Farrell Penguin. He's unrecognizable in that makeup, and I'm really excited to see what they do with it in the series. I think they're going to expand it, and I think we're going to get a fully formed kind of crime boss, unified crime boss in Gotham by the time we get to the Batman 2. Speaking of crime families, this is Roman Sionis, aka Black Mask. And Black Mask isn't crazy at all. He's just a mobster who inherits his family's crime syndicate after Batman is done taking out all the crime lords in Gotham. Now, the year one comics of Batman and then the movie that's based on them, Batman Begins, kind of sets up a world where there were mobsters and organized crime. Batman shows up. He basically puts the five families to bed, and then in their place, these kind of crazier masked heroes or masked villains show up, starting with the Joker. For Black Mask, he sees that happening. He sees the crime in Gotham going more and more to what he calls the masks. And so his answer in the comics is to actually just go all in. He's faking insanity at this point. So he's like, what's the kookiest thing I could come up with? Oh yeah, I'm gonna dig my dad's coffin up and make a mask out of the coffin lid. Like his black mask is made out of his dad's coffin. And he still runs the Sionis crime family like they're one of, if not the only functioning traditional crime family. They just happen to have a mask as their head. And then he wears a literal mask. So this is actually pretty genius. I love Black Mask. He's really underrated. I was really bummed in Arkham Origins that Black Mask wasn't the true villain. And I think uh, Ewan McGregor looks like he's having a blast playing him in the Birds of Prey movie, but which really shouldn't have been called Birds of Prey. Um, but uh, I really wish they'd given him his due and they stopped making him like a two-bit villain and actually make him scary. And then finally we have Selina. Selina Kyle is your cat burglar who, just like Roman, adopts a persona to fit in the world she exists in. Um, she may, in certain uh, iterations, is a former sex worker who turns realizes it's way easier to rob uh, prospective clients than to sleep with them, and then becomes like a really high-end, very skilled thief. Um, there would not be at all a single jury member who would balk at putting, Black Mask or Catwoman or Ra's or any of those folks in regular prison. And in fact, Selena, I don't think ever goes to Arkham outside of when people conspire to put her there. Yeah, she doesn't really belong in Arkham with some of the crazier folks. Now, there's a bunch of other Batman villains we didn't talk about, right? This is kind of the most famous ones on the sliding scale. There's definitely some other really, really, really crazy folks out there. Like we didn't talk about the Doll Maker. We didn't talk about Professor Pig. We didn't talk about oh goodness, we didn't talk about the Court of Owls and or the Talons, and we didn't talk about Abattoir, and we didn't really talk about um, some of the other uh, we didn't talk about the ventriloquist and Scarface, some of those other folks that have really clear mental health issues. We just stuck with the heavy hitters and kind of worked our way through and talked about how the law and the mental health professions would interact with them. Now, I think what's important to remember here is that This is an end all and be all. And while I'm neither a clinical psychologist nor a district attorney, I do have a lot of experience in both of those areas, and I've obviously consulted people about this lecture. Um, it's important to think then that while we talked about policing last week, and we've talked about kind of how the law gets made beforehand, this is the final stage, right? When we talk about criminal justice system, we go, okay, first someone makes a law, and then the law enforcers arrest you or enforce that law, and then you're brought before this kind of final place where you're judged one way or another, and then your fate is determined. Um, it's an interlocking system, and it's a system that is designed to protect and propagate itself. And so there are problems at every stage, right? From the type of government we have, through all the problems with modern policing, through kind of the way we assess someone's guilt. There are a lot of issues. Is the system perfect? No. Is it irrevocably broken? Is it wrong all the time? Also, no. Um, and I like to hope that we're getting better all the time, that we're getting closer to a place where there are less innocent people who are locked up, and there are more folks getting help for their mental health than being put in prison. Um, but all of that takes time, and it takes public awareness, and it takes activism. It takes you all standing up and saying, hey, this isn't right, and we need to make a change here. So that's it for this week. Um, Coming up soon, I'm going to put you in your writing groups. So you absolutely should be right now working on a draft of your paper, and you should have a rough draft done by the end of this week, um, and ready to start showing people in a week or so. The paper you give to me, I'm reiterating, 6 pages exactly, a literary analysis, and needs to be a final draft. The paper you turn in during finals week needs to be a sophomore level final draft. If it's not, you won't pass the class. You won't meet the university ULO, University Learning Outcome. That's a requirement from the state of Idaho that I assess you as a second year writer. So if you don't turn in a satisfactory piece of writing that a sophomore could construct, you're not going to pass, regardless of your class score, regardless of your points. So please be working on your paper. It's very important. You should be writing already. Again, as always, if you have any questions, reach out via email, and I will see you in the next one.